My grandmother put greedy pastors in their place twice, even after her death. My grandmother was a member of a large conservative Christian church her entire adult life. This church, which I will call church, was part of a large evangelical denomination. Bequat Church was located in a thriving suburb of a major city in the southern USA. My grandmother was a very active member of Bequat Church. Every Sunday morning, she worked in the church's preschool, helped prepare hundreds of breakfasts and dinners for the community, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church trips and choir tours. On Sunday evenings, she led a youth Bible study, actively participated in missionary work, and helped with other youth programs. She always gave a tithe and often donated above that to missions and special collections. My grandmother has a gift. She knows how to make other people feel important. I have seen it many times myself, even though I attended a different church. I often visited my grandmother and attended church events with her. I saw her preparing breakfast alone for dozens of teenagers from the church. Mind you, a job that took more than 2 hours even in a huge church kitchen. And after the meal, she asked everyone to applaud the high school student who helped organize the prayer breakfast. He did so well. I remember during one youth trip to a church camp, my grandmother drove almost all night back to the city to pick up a box of evangelistic materials that one of the pastor's assistants had forgotten. I will call him the assistant. He asked my grandmother to bring them to the morning session. His supervisor, the senior pastor, never found out that the assistant had messed up, and my grandmother fixed everything. The assistant didn't even thank her, although I was a child. Then it upset me terribly, and I asked my grandmother why she agreed. She said it didn't bother her, and her reward would be that these materials would help children find Jesus. My grandmother's work in the church abruptly ended at age 73, when she injured her spine in a car accident. For the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound, unable to attend church due to this injury and declining health with age. Her mind remained clear, her faith sincere, but her body failed her more each day. During these 10 years, she repeatedly tried to reconnect with her church, its leadership, and friends from the congregation. She invited them to visit her at home, but unsuccessfully. Each of these invitations was either declined or simply ignored. Toward the end, when she was already in palliative care at home, my grandmother decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandfather called the church and asked that the senior pastor, whom she had known for over 30 years, come to her. They wanted the service to take place at the church and planned to discuss it with him. But the senior pastor was too busy, and instead, a few days later, the assistant came. According to my grandfather, here is how that meeting went while my grandmother was literally at death's door. The three of them, grandmother, grandfather, and the assistant, talked about the funeral for a couple of minutes, and then the assistant began pressuring her, urging her to store up treasures in heaven and not forget her church and her will. Grandfather firmly told him, now is not the time or place to discuss her will. They briefly returned to discussing the funeral. But the assistant again turned the conversation to the grandmother's will, generously adding speeches about how much her church needed her support. Grandfather repeated several times that talking to a dying woman about her will and the church's financial needs was inappropriate, especially given that she was experiencing severe physical pain. The assistant seemed to agree and spoke about the funeral again, but then invariably returned to the topic of money, heavenly rewards, quoting, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." From Matthew chapter 6, verse 21. From Luke chapter 12, verse 34, and so on. My grandmother began to cry. To help you understand, my grandmother was not just a strong woman. She was a titan covered in diamond, wrapped in Kevlar. She almost never cried and certainly never cried for herself. Not a single tear when the doctor told her her spine was broken so badly that she would never walk again, even after 6 months of futile rehabilitation. At funerals, visiting relatives in the hospital, when receiving bad news, she could cry. Sincerely but restrained, she cried to comfort others. Weep with those who weep. But no one, neither my grandfather, nor her daughter, my mother, nor her uncle, nor my grandmother's siblings, remembered her ever crying for herself. My grandmother sobbed explosively. My grandfather, a former Boilermaker, retired Marine, sergeant and Korean War veteran, grabbed the assistant and literally threw him out of their house. Not very delicately. Against all expectations, my grandmother lived another 6 months purely on willpower. Eventually, she passed away, and we held the funeral at the funeral home, not at Big White Church. The senior pastor and the assistant were conspicuously absent. Moreover, there was not a single clergy member from Bequat Church at the service, neither in the hall nor on the stage at all. At the beginning of the ceremony, my grandfather went to the podium before those gathered and said, "Some of you may have heard that I did not invite the senior pastor and the assistant to this service. I believe now is not the place or time to explain my reasons. But you all know me, and know that my reasons were substantial. Moreover, my wife herself asked me not to invite them. This service will be different from those you may have attended. It will be an open microphone service. Anyone who wants can come up here, talk about their friendship with my wife, recall a story worth remembering, or say something that honors her memory and brings comfort to all gathered here today. I asked several family members to prepare speeches, but it is not required. If you want to say something, come up and speak." About 100 people attended the funeral. At least a third of them ended up at the microphone. The service we planned for half an hour lasted more than 2 hours. And as far as I understand, no one left early. There was laughter, tears, and hugs. 3 grandchildren played her favorite songs on the piano and guitar. We all held hands and sang together. After the ceremony, dozens of people told my grandfather that it was one of the most touching and heartfelt funerals they had ever attended. Many added, "Funeral without pastors is better," or something to that effect. A couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing the inheritance according to my grandmother's will. Although my grandmother and grandfather loved each other dearly, they had separate wills. As my grandmother explained to my mother, it made it easier to respect each other's boundaries. The lawyer also recommended it. No one thought they had any great wealth. They had lived more than 50 years in the same small, cozy house in a prosperous suburb. They worked a lot and led a modest lifestyle. But according to rumors, they had decent savings. Of course, there was no legal obligation to participate in reading the will, and such events have become rare nowadays due to universal literacy and communication tools. But in our family, reading the will was a tradition. It was one of those rare occasions when our large, close-knit family gathered. We did not have family reunions. It is too difficult to organize with such a large family. But we gathered for birthdays, holidays, and funerals. So attending a few such events meant seeing almost all cousins, aunts, uncles, as well as great-aunts and great-uncles, and the grandparents' siblings. Considering this tradition, wills in our family often contained very personal gifts that had little monetary value, but were a way to pass on a final warm memory or a piece of the soul to loved ones. Moreover, grandfather subtly hinted that there would be surprises in grandmother's will, and family gossip spread the rumors actively. The reading took place in a law firm's conference room. Expectedly, my mother, aunts, uncles, cousins, and many grandchildren were there. But what really surprised us was the appearance of the senior pastor and assistant from Bequat Church. They reported that my grandmother's lawyer told them her will contained not only donations to the church, but also personal gifts for both of them. Perhaps it only seemed so to us, but it was hard for me, my siblings, and cousins not to notice. The 2 of them looked as if they were drooling in anticipation of grandmother's generosity. My grandmother had a large family, so there were quite a few heirs in the will. The conference room in the lawyer's office was slightly smaller than an average living room in a middle-class home. Additional chairs were brought in, all seats were taken, and the remaining space was filled by standing people, the room barely held us all. My grandmother's lawyer suggested seating the senior pastor and assistant next to him. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant that the lawyer and both pastors faced everyone else. The preachers seemed flattered to be in the spotlight, but unlike us, they did not notice that these seats allowed the others to observe them closely, and getting to the door without interrupting the meeting was now almost impossible for them. They were seated farthest from the exit, with about 24 people between them and the door. The inheritance turned out to be generous but generally expected. Grandfather received their house, all its contents, pension savings, and everything remaining after distributing other gifts. Children, grandchildren, and several local charities received pleasant, though not enormous, sums. Some sentimental items were given to friends and relatives. The will listed grandfather first, followed by other recipients in ascending order of gift value. At first, there were memorable items with almost no monetary value. Then each grandchild was entitled to several $1,000s. Then slightly. More went to each son, daughter, brother, sister, nephew, and niece. Then quite decent sums were received by several local charitable organizations, and so on. Donations to Big Church for the senior pastor and the assistant were almost at the very end of the list. They politely listened to everything before, but with growing impatience, especially when they noticed how with each line read aloud, grandmother's generosity increased. When the lawyer got to the part concerning Big Church and the pastors, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce the bequeathed amounts for Big Church's senior pastor and assistant, Miss Grandmother's name asked me to read the following letter to everyone present." He unfolded a letter written in Grandmother's handwriting. For the past 10 years, no one from Big White Church had called me, come to visit, or even sent a note to say they remembered me. Not a single pastor, not a single deacon, not one of the women of the church, nor any of the parishioners I had worked with for so many years, whom I sincerely loved and considered friends. I worked hard for you for many years when you needed me. And when I needed you and my church, you acted as if I did not exist. The only visit I received was when I was near death and invited the senior pastor to my home to help plan my funeral. This was my last attempt after many attempts over the past 10 years to reconnect with my church and the pastor I still deeply loved, despite them clearly showing that they did not love me. I hoped that if I could arrange the funeral at the church, perhaps some of my old parish friends, whom I hadn't seen for decades, would come to say goodbye. I knew how much they loved listening to the senior pastor's sermons, and if they would speak at my memorial, maybe they would come at least. For that, even if they didn't want to come for me. But the senior pastor did not even find time to just call and say whether he would conduct the memorial. And the assistant came to see me but did not talk about the funeral. He only wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's all. Just remember the church in the will. And then I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart one last time. But this was the last time. The very last. The assistant didn't know that when he came, Grandpa and I had already prepared my will. And then it actually included a double tithe, 20% of all my property for the church, which was once mine and now my former church, Big White Church. This sum was named, and it was just an astonishing amount of money, which caused a stifled wow from many of the heirs, including me. But then I felt a little embarrassed that we had not mentioned by name such wonderful people as the senior pastor and the assistant, so I changed the will to include them by name. At the same time, I changed the sum bequeathed to Big White Church, so that it corresponded to all the love they had shown me over the past 10 years of my life, when I suffered, was lonely, and could no longer work for them for free, as I had done for almost half a century. "That's all she wrote," said the lawyer. "Now let's return to the distribution of the inheritance according to the will. Bequest to the senior pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to the assistant, 1 cent. Bequest to Big White Church, 1 cent. The senior pastor and assistant sat with faces as if both had just been injected with a pallet of Novocaine into the jaw. Every one of grandmother's relatives and friends had an overwhelming desire to laugh out loud. But we restrained ourselves because we knew grandmother. We knew this was not the end. She was only preparing the ground for the real strike. The best was ahead, and we did not want to miss it. "There is another bequest," continued the lawyer, "to a charitable organization. He named it, but I will call it Black Charity." He paused before announcing the amount. Most of us had no idea what kind of organization it was, but from the expressions of the senior pastor and assistant, it became clear. They knew Black Charity very well. Their faces expressed shock, horror, and panic, as if the lawyer had just said, "This donation is going to demonic child eaters to buy giant grills and tons of charcoal for barbecue." All eyes in the room turned to the pastors. The lawyer, who was also my uncle, one of grandmother and grandfather's sons, let this pause linger for a few more seconds. If we could read the thoughts of the senior pastor and assistant, we would understand why their faces looked like that. Black Charity, a charitable organization at a large black church just a few kilometers from Big White Church. They were engaged in free distribution of food and clothing, helping foster children, delivering prepared meals to the elderly, providing legal support, and other social programs. Many years ago, Big White Church, which was and still is 100% white, for several years provided Black Charity with financial and other assistance. But then a very painful and messy split occurred, allegedly because Black Charity practiced social gospel, while Big White Church practiced the true gospel. White Church even sued them, trying to get back some of the money. In the end, the case was settled, but the residue remained. But since it all happened in the southern U.S., everyone knew the real reason Big White Church, like any white church, stopped supporting Black Charity. Grandmother and grandfather seriously considered leaving Big White Church at that time, but ultimately decided it was better to stay and preach tolerance through words and personal example. They understood that they could not convince everyone, but perhaps they could reach the youth in their white church and break this multi-generational cycle of racism. Grandmother always told us, "My church is my mission field." We only understood the true meaning of these words after her death. Since then, grandmother and grandfather secretly donated part of their tithe to Black Charity every month. Most of our family, including me, learned about this only after the service ended. As for the senior pastor and assistant, without a doubt, they fully understood what grandmother was trying to tell them, not with words but with actions, which speak louder than any words. If you grew up in yoga and were a white person, you would understand too. The message was clear. These people, whom you despise and oppress, are more deserving than you, and they are the ones worthy of my money, not you. After enough time had passed for everyone in the room to observe the expressions of the senior pastor and assistant as they digested how they themselves, along with their church, had treated our grandmother, the lawyer said, "The amount is," and then he announced exactly the same amount that was stated in grandmother's letter, the very huge amount that would have gone to Big White Church if she had not changed her will. Thank you for listening to it till the end. Be sure to comment on what you think about it. Also, of course, watch our previous video, which you can see here. And good luck to you.